As the introduction said, I work for PricewaterhouseCoopers in London. We've done a number of proof of concepts with clients over the last 2 years, including one with the Bank of England, which drew a great deal of publicity. And what I'm going to talk about is some of the practical use cases that we've been talking to our clients about, and how we think blockchain is going to be a significantly disruptive and huge opportunity for industry, and that, I would say, is industry much more widely than financial services. What problem is blockchain solving? And you've had some of this already with the previous speaker, who very clearly explained some of the opportunity to share information. The World Economic Forum report, which came out last year, highlighted the opportunity to potentially disrupt, in their words, the way that financial institutions operate. I think that's wrong. I think it's the way that all major institutions operate, in fact. And why is that? Number one, the shared version of the truth, for anyone who's worked at any length of time in any business, knows that we all keep our own separate copies of data. We send each other messages to update that data. We try and work out why the message hasn't arrived. We rekey, we send each other copies of our data to try and reconcile with each other. So sharing one common view of the truth, which stays in line throughout a transaction, is an enormous potential step forward with huge potential savings. The first ones I saw were in banking, but they exist in many other industries. Imagine, if you can, that you can share information in this way. You can start thinking about orchestrating a process, not only focusing on your own company's straight-through processing, but on straight-through processing for each participant in a chain, because you orchestrate the interactions that all of you have in the most efficient manner. Smart contracts have been touched upon. You can automate through smart contracts. Scalability, I'll touch on scalability vis-a-vis the blockchain debate later, but the Bitcoin debate later, but scalability within the network, because as you add nodes to a network of participants, it automatically scales, is one of the potential benefits of this technology. There's no single point of failure in a blockchain network. All the multiple participants are all transacting and keeping the chain running. And one of the things that our proof of concept for the Bank of England highlighted was that you could shut down one node, which was the regulator node, and the rest of the network could continue to operate. And the reason the Bank of England were interested in that is that the RTGS system, the clearing system for the UK, closed down during October 2014, and the banks were unable to transact with each other because there's a single point of failure in that system. By distributing the processing across multiple participants, you eliminate that problem. We did a recent survey, PwC, in which 77% of respondents said they expected to have live blockchain applications by 2020. That number was greater in the countries and territories which are more familiar with blockchain. So North America, the most familiar, the result was 100%. That's interesting in that that's 3 years' time. We're talking that there was over 1,000 respondents, CFO, CIO, CEO, CTO of firms, responding, saying that in 3 years' time there'll be significant blockchain applications out there, which is interesting when you start to think about your technology plans today and technology projects which maybe are going to take a year or two to deliver. Touch on this very quickly. Government, which traditionally had some less complementary views of Bitcoin, maybe with some concerns around Bitcoin use that won't have gone down any given the recent WannaCry ransom attack. But actually, if they distinguish Bitcoin and blockchain as two separate things, are positive towards blockchain, which the UK government now refers to as distributed ledger technology, and there was a very positive report from the UK Chief Scientific Advisor. There's a quote there from Dr. Bin Bisha from the Smart Dubai city, where Smart Dubai is looking to use blockchain for a number of government services. In terms of thinking about what use cases does blockchain address in a business, and there are some that kind of see this as a cure-all for almost any problem that exists. But we have a test, a simple 6-question test that we apply, and if you can tick at least 4 of these 6, then you possibly have a good use case for blockchain. Number 1, do multiple parties need to share data between them? So all the participants need to see a common view of a transaction. Do multiple parties need to update that data? Not necessarily all, but at least more than one. Do I need this to be right? This is not Wikipedia. It can't can't iterate its way to rightness. I need each verified transaction to be correct. I care about what's in there. If there are intermediaries that sit in the middle and update a record for everyone, then do those intermediaries add cost or complexity that could be removed? If you are an intermediary at this moment, you may be feeling slightly uncomfortable. I'll come back to that point. Are the interactions time sensitive? Do you care when it happens, or do you care the speed at which it happens? And do transactions interact? And we say that if you can tick 4 out of 6, you've got a possible use case for your business. If it's less than 4 out of 6, you've probably got more conventional technologies you should be exploring. But I would postulate that, or I would make the hypothesis that in most businesses you'll find some painful, difficult to do business uses that will meet at least the majority of these questions. So let's select some, and I've tried to highlight examples where there is real movement and initiatives that are out there. So digital currency, and we touched on Bitcoin. Let me be clear here, I am not talking about Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is an extremely interesting and clever innovation, but ultimately for significant business, in particular in financial services, people want real money. People want central backed fiat currency. One of the clients that I deal with, which is a major investment bank, made the comment, I'm not going to settle a $200 million bond trade with Bitcoin. And that has led, I think, to some of the existing banking infrastructure looking at ways that you can get a digital asset which is actually representative one-for-one to fiat currency onto a blockchain. The Bank of China has completed a trial with its major commercial banks where it effectively minted digital currency and allowed the major Chinese banks to settle their interbank obligations between them. The Canadian Central Bank did something very similar. The Bank of England did a very interesting paper on the potential macroeconomic impacts of a central bank digital currency. And actually, I just noticed when I was researching for this, you can find a new item on Google every day if you look around blockchain, is in Senegal, the central bank has announced that they are thinking about an e-CFA. So that's one route in which you may get fiat currency represented on a blockchain that can then be, in almost real time, transmitted between participants in a way that avoids using the existing payments infrastructure, in a way that avoids using the SWIFT network and the costs associated, in particular with cross-border transfer of assets. Another way that's being thought of, which avoids the need to convince a central bank that this is a good idea, is being addressed by 5 global banks, including UBS, Deutsche Bank, and a number of others, where they would effectively create the major currencies that they transact in They would put those into some sort of trust arrangement, publish back from that a digital representation of that value, and then use that between themselves to settle some of their major cash flows. Again, potentially intraday, again, potentially, well, actually not potentially, avoiding entirely the existing payment infrastructure mechanisms, the SWIFT network, the correspondent banking arrangements that drive delay and cause extra cost in that arrangement. That's one example. Another example, and one that is close to my heart, when I first started work, I started work as a technology developer. The first program I ever wrote was to settle a securities trade. So the first thing I had to try and understand was why it was I needed to send a message to somebody to tell them to settle it, to get a message back to tell me that they'd done it, to send them another message to ask them had they actually achieved it, to send them another message at the end of the day to see that our records still look the same and that our balances look the same. I can just go back, it's actually 30-something years, and look at myself and say, if I'd have known about this technology, I'd be saying, are you serious? Do we really do it like that? So the idea that you can potentially put a record of the share ownership or a bond ownership, any securities ownership, onto a blockchain is a very attractive one. It's been explored by NASDAQ, who actually have a live application. Interestingly, they've chosen to do it with private companies, unlisted companies, so that their first step is a small step with a less liquid security. But that's up and running and has been running for, I guess, almost a year now. DTCC, so the Depository Trust and Clearing Company, the central depository company, effectively the ultimate intermediary in the United States, have kind of woken up to question 4 and said, we're going to start exploring this technology ourselves, and they're looking to launch a service around the repo trading of US government bonds, which has a benefit in terms of speed, that will use a distributed ledger technology, and their plans are to be live in 2017, so still sometime this year. And CLS, who are also a major intermediary, sitting at the middle of the major FX clearing platforms, also looking to introduce a new service which will take currently financial foreign exchange transactions between two parties and look at them in a way that introduces a new service with distributed ledger. But to move to something entirely different, for those not from banking or financial services, one of the other areas that's attracted a lot of interest is supply chain. And if you think about a supply chain where a component manufacturer manufactures something which are then picked up in one country and taken to potentially a shipper that ships it to a different country where it's again picked up and then moved on to the final consumer of that piece of goods. There's a whole sequence of events which today attract either, if they're tracked at all electronically, it's someone's central system that you need to go and look at. The chances are it's quite manual, and that leaves open a number of problems around, for example, fraudulent goods, the provenance of goods, loss of goods, and just general inefficiency. To say nothing of other parties that may be interested in that chain, for example, insurers who are interested about when the component goes onto the vessel and when it comes off the vessel, or in a banking environment, if a bank is providing trade finance, the bank that is interested at what point the goods arrive onshore or potentially arrive with the buyer of the goods. And this is an area which actually really started to accelerate last year, and there are a number of initiatives which are underway. Maersk, one of the biggest shipping firms in the world, is combining Internet of Things container locks, which go onto the container and tell Maersk where the container is in the world through its journey as they ship goods around the world. Walmart in the United States is using a distributed ledger blockchain to track produce so that it can stand behind its promises on freshness of produce. Alibaba, actually, in China, has announced that it's launching an application which will track the provenance of goods into China, so that if someone is advertising chicken as coming from overseas, from Australia, and being free range, or beef probably from overseas being free range, then it is, and they can prove that. And on a slightly different approach to it, but it's the same basic problem that's being solved, Barclays conducted a trade finance live pilot, so a real movement of value, where they issued a letter of credit in 4 hours for the export of butter from Ireland to the Seychelles. And the lady from Barclays who runs their trade finance business, I spoke to her and said, you know, what's the detailed business case for this? And she said, the detailed business case doesn't matter. I just tell anyone who knows anything about trade finance that I issued a letter of credit in 4 hours instead of many days. Just in the interest of time and not overrunning, insurance has been an area that we've done some work. Again, if you Google insurance blockchain, you'll come up with any number of studies and potential pilots. Allianz has tested a catastrophe bond. A catastrophe bond is a pretty interesting idea for a use of a smart contract. This is an instrument which fundamentally pays out to all of its holders on a verifiable event occurring, such as a weather event. So by automating that and potentially showing that it could be handled extremely cheaply, there's a possibility of catastrophe bonds being actually used much more widely than where they are today. We did work with Lloyd's of London. PwC built a proof of concept in 6 weeks for the Lloyd's of London Association, which is still probably, I think, the biggest international insurance market in the world for wholesale insurance. It automated the claims management process. And we demonstrated a process that normally takes days, if not weeks, could potentially be completed in hours. In order to do that, we built a permissioned blockchain, so a limited use blockchain, which had just known participants in it. We put the absolutely most vital information onto the chain, but because we wanted to build something in 6 weeks, we took a lot of the documentation that supports a major insurance contract and wrote that down as a document. So that was not captured as data within a blockchain, which would give you an enormous amount of data to capture, but we took just the kernel of the most important data that was needed, put that into the blockchain. And one of the things that you can do with blockchain relatively easily is use the hashing to hash a scanned document and keep that somewhere else. And the hash tells you you're always looking at the document that was actually written away. It can't be replaced. So by simplifying some of the complexity of the claims process, even in 6 weeks, we were able to show something which takes away a lot of manual effort and potentially allows the settlement of a claim to happen in hours rather than days. An entirely different one, and actually one that I've taken from a colleague that works in our German practice, if I'm honest. This is the idea of using the technology connected again to Internet of Things, where you can take a reading. Because of the way the technology works, you can timestamp the reading that you've got in a way that is tamper-proof, as the previous speaker explained, and also use that information to make some smart decisions. So in the example that we're looking at here, this is actually the idea of potentially in electricity grid, in power grids, to utilize the monitoring of the power grid and surge demand versus surge production to switch energy around the power grid and make the optimal use of the cheapest supply energy, although in the case that's kind of quoted there, it's actually renewable energy. It's making the optimal use of renewable energy in a live application which is in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn microgrid, which is obviously a relatively small scale application, but much bigger is the example from Germany, which my colleague was telling me about, where the Sonnen Group will be using a very similar type of idea of monitoring the events that are happening in the power network and a blockchain and smart contracts to optimize supply. I'll just touch briefly on this. It goes to the heart of one of the reasons that I think in our own dealings with the Bank of England and others, regulators have started to become more comfortable with this technology. There are a number of beneficial effects which government sees. Number one is the efficient, cost-effective financial markets. Santander did a estimate in a study that they ran of a $20 billion US saving per annum across securities settlement and FX settlement. So that's 20 billion in wasted cost, just frictional cost to the whole market, which eventually trickles its way down to end investors. So if we can cut out that cost, then you can improve the returns to your end investors, and that's something that is in everyone's interest, particularly as populations age. Resilience, we touched on resilience. There's no single point of failure, and that was something that Mark Carney spoke about in a speech, having had it demonstrated to him by the proof of concept that we built for the bank. Potential to stimulate trade. Financial inclusion is one that I think is quite interesting. We've been speaking to the Global Mobile Payments Association about some of the issues where mobile banking has made a big impact on creating financial inclusion, but because of the way it's happened, there's fragmentation between the different mobile network providers. And the potential for using a blockchain which allows you to potentially have a interchangeable coin that could work on different mobile providers will help to overcome that kind of problem. So that's one actually that I've become quite personally interested in. And traceable government payments, that's maybe one final one to touch on. Another reason government's interested in that, in the United Kingdom, we've been working with a company called GovCoin, which is paying benefits to 2,000 benefits claimants in Manchester using a digital currency. So this is effectively the government minting a digital UK pound and paying that to benefits claimants in a way that is traceable. The reason that they're doing that actually is not to be Big Brother and see what do they spend their money on. It's to give them an application which tells them what they spend their money on. Because one of the things about the unbanked is that they generally don't have a good, sophisticated understanding of where their money goes. So a whole raft of potentially beneficial impacts of this technology. Lest anyone think it's easy to overcome the challenges, one of the main challenges I think actually is, as we've explained, a lot of the business benefit comes from the interaction between multiple participants in a transaction. And therefore, you kind of need to cooperate together to understand how you're going to achieve that cooperation. So what standards are you going to apply around the data that you transact and transmit? What business processes do you need to have in place? That's one of, I think, the big challenges, and you're seeing consortia form, big consortia in some cases, and in some cases smaller consortia, like the example of the utility settlement coin guys. But but getting that understanding of cooperation is a big one. Legal frameworks I'm not going to touch on because I'm not a lawyer, and we have a distinguished lawyer that's going to speak about this later. Settling in fiat cash, ultimately, big transactions, big intercompany transactions, be they bank or whatever, in the hundreds of millions of dollars, need to be settled in fiat cash. That's what people want. They want the certainty of fiat cash. Actually, I want the certainty of fiat cash in my investments in my pension fund. Scalability, I'll touch back on scalability and a regulatory framework. You need to work with the regulator. The regulator that we have spoken to most is the PRA Bank of England, but I've also spoken to the Hong Kong Monetary Authority and the Singapore Monetary Authority more recently. The question they ask is not specifically about, is this technology okay? The question they ask is, how can my regulatory outcomes be achieved using this technology? The regulator today doesn't tell you to use an Oracle database rather than a Microsoft SQL Server database. The regulator cares that you can meet your obligations, you've got a resilient network, and that you can report to the regulator in the way that you need to. I'm going to skip that slide in the interest of time. The scalability debate. So those that are familiar with Bitcoin, Bitcoin has a limitation on its scalability. So 7 transactions a minute, 7 transactions a second, let's say, and roughly 10 minutes to confirm a block going onto Bitcoin, which is fine actually for what it's intended to do for the use case. That works okay. But for a major transaction in a major market, that's not going to be fast enough. And here, I'll draw a distinction between permissioned and permissionless blockchains. So some of the pictures that we looked at, for example, the settlement of a securities transaction, that is not a club that anyone can join. That's a club that participants that are trading securities between themselves are joining. And therefore you will know who the participants of the chain are, which has, and I think that in many of the cases, the insurance case, a permission chain where you know and you can see, and there is KYC AML, there's identity, that I understand who I'm transacting with on the chain. Many of the use cases that I've covered will be using that type of approach. Not alone, but that also simplifies life when it comes to how you go about doing the consensus mechanism on the blockchain. And there are different consensus mechanisms that don't use the same approach that Bitcoin does, which can be far more scalable. And indeed, for the Bank of England PwC, that was delivered with a 20 transaction a second limit. We put in a different consensus engine, one which uses an approach called proof of stake rather than proof of work, an engine called Tendermint, and we could immediately demonstrate 10,000 transactions a second. Most of the big platforms that are out there and developments are looking at this. You won't be able to read that slide. I'm not going to go through that slide in detail. There are a whole raft of different underlying blockchain platforms out there. I'll just draw attention perhaps, and I think that will continue to be the case, and I don't think that should scare us. It's just going to be part of the evolution that people will develop applications on different chains. How they interact will be something that's interesting. One of the reasons I think there'll be multiple is you've got Hyperledger, for example, which is from the Linux Foundation and IBM's backing that. And then you've got Ethereum, and Enterprise Ethereum is being backed by Microsoft. So you can guarantee that at least 2 of the platforms up there, but actually multiple more will continue to exist and people will continue to work with them successfully. I'm not going to touch on that in the interest of time again so that I can finish. 1 minute. Perfect. Here's the questions I intended to leave you with. So Questions to ask yourself: does it disrupt my business? A big question, I think, since I saw the results of our 2017 survey, is that if there is going to be blockchain applications live and they are as disruptive as we think they're going to be by 2020, then any projects that you have running that are starting now and have a 2-year delivery window, you should be thinking about how those are going to be impacted by that. Because otherwise there's a danger that you're going to deliver a nice new shiny system into a world that has changed. And that, I think, in particular for this group, is one of the challenges for you to take away.